So good evening to all. My name is Barry Levine, and today's presentation is an overview of Willow Run's incredible history. A full story of it would be a college course. I'm confident each of you have been touched either directly or indirectly by our story. Thanks to the Westland Library for hosting me tonight. A bit of background. My father was in the Army Air Force in World War II up in the Aleutians. Then he worked for local car dealers back home in Connecticut, so I always liked airplanes and cars, so this seemed like a natural. I didn't appreciate Willow Run's history until I started volunteering there in 2015 at the Yankee Air Museum. I'm a docent. I've published 2 books, both touching on Willow Run. One's about Yankee Air Museum itself. The other is Michigan Aviation, which is a series of short stories that I got published on Amazon last year. Usually retails for $19 on Amazon. It's yours, author's autograph included, for $10 tonight if you're so inclined. No obligation, of course. And it's also on Amazon if you change your mind later. So this is the east side entrance. Thanks to many people, starting with my family, the Yankee Air Museum, GM Archives, and you can see the organizations there. And there's so many people and organizations with a Willow Run connection, it just goes on and on. One disclaimer, recapping history is never a straight line process. There's always differing variations of what happened, who said what and when. All I can tell you is I tried to sort it out as best I could. In many ways, Willow Run's a microcosm of the U.S. aviation and auto industries, and there's some great human interest stories as well. This is Willow Run itself. It's a very small stream that runs through the area. It doesn't look like anything special, but in the 80 years that there's been industrial activity there, there's been aviation, auto and transmission manufacturing, military research, an airport with air freight and passenger airlines, an aviation history museum, a research center for new automotive technologies. Companies have come and gone. Willow Run remains. Originally, this area had been farmland. In 1931, Henry Ford purchased about 1,400 acres of what was known as Quirk Farms. And he developed something called Camp Willow Run, which is what you're looking at here, excuse me, for boys whose dads were killed or injured in World War I. These kids worked in the fields and they learned job skills along the line. Overseas, however, trouble was looming in the late 30s and early 1940s. Germany and Japan were aggressively rearming. Our political and military leadership knew we needed to ramp up military production quickly. At the beginning of World War II, the United States had the world's 19th largest military. So we were behind the 8 ball and we knew it. So we had a very long way to go. Aviation became front and center. And one of President Roosevelt's fireside chats was in May 1940, where he said that government must harness the efficient machinery of America's manufacturers to produce 50,000 combat aircraft a year. At the time, our entire inventory of combat aircraft was about 3,000, most of which were obsolete that the Germans or Japanese would have shot right out of the sky, no problem at all. Here at home, Mr. Ford was not interested in a munitions plant at all. He was something of a pacifist. He had little interest in overseas involvement, but he gave in once he realized the government might have nationalized Ford properties for war purposes. One weapon was a B-24 Liberator, which we'll hear more about shortly. That's a 4-engine heavy bomber designed by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego. So in January 1941, Edsel Ford, Henry's son, Henry Ford II, the Deuce, Benson Ford, the Deuce's brother, and Charles Sorensen, who was Ford's chief engineer at the time, that's who you see here, arrived at Consolidated for a look. And what they saw was Consolidated essentially was custom building these B-24s, and his conclusion was what they had was totally unsuitable for the mass production of aircraft. Goes back to his hotel room, must have loaded up on a gallon of coffee, and he pulls an all-nighter and he sketched out what essentially became Willow Run, the actual design of what the plant and the layout would be. His focus was standard interchangeable parts, machined to precise tolerances, and a continuous workflow with assembly stations where workers and machines perform repetitive tasks. So essentially an auto assembly line on steroids. The architect for the plant was Alfred Kahn. This was the last structure he designed before his death in 1942. They broke ground in late March, early April 1941. This was not a repurposed auto plant. This was wheat, soybeans, apple orchards, whatever it was. It was not a car factory at the time. By the end of 1941, they had parts production coming down the line, and the first B-24 teaching tool came down the line in May of 42. At one time, it was the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world at 3.5 million square feet. Ford managed the plant on behalf of the government. Success was not preordained. In the early days, the plant was known as Will It Run, as in, will the airplanes run? Because there was such poor quality coming off the line. And this is that first B-24 in the line. You think about it, the cars of the day had 15,000 parts, approximately, weighed about 3,000 pounds. B-24s had 450,000 parts, 360,000 rivets, and there were over 550 variants of rivets, and the aircraft weighed 18 tons, so it's an order of magnitude more complex making a B-24 than a car. The military was part of the problem. They had 575 significant change orders in the first year of production, meaning they had required new tooling, new blueprints, new training, resequenced the production line. It just made managing the production process very difficult. There was very little aviation expertise in Metro Detroit or Michigan at the time. Ford had built 200 tri-motors, but a tri-motor is a tinker toy compared to a B-24. There's just no comparison. The plant itself was enormous. Many materials were delivered by a New York Central rail spur right to the plant. B-24 engines were made by Buick in Illinois and delivered by train right into the plant, and here's an advertisement that Buick ran saying what a great job they were doing. There were 4 cranes, 30,000 pounds each, used to unload train cars. The plant was deafening. There were hydraulic presses that stamped out parts from like rolls of sheet metal or aluminum. Sounded like a car hitting a tree over and over and over again. The rivet guns were all air-powered, so a tremendous racket. Typically, there were 2 9-hour shifts a day, so you're on your feet 9 hours a day. The plant's not air-conditioned. There's no OSHA, so this is not a great place to work. Ford built the Aircraft Apprentice School to teach workers about high-precision aeronautical manufacturing. So they were trying everything possible to get the workers up to speed on what they needed to do. The housing stock was completely inadequate. Ypsilanti and the surrounding communities were small farm towns before the war, and then all of a sudden you had this huge influx of people. So you had people sleeping in chicken coops, trailers, cars. It was just unmanageable, stuff you would just never put up with today. Willow Run Village was built, and there was no privacy, little room, minimal amenities, so this is not suburban America. The Detroit Industrial Freeway was built to help get people to work, as well as get parts out from the Rouge and Dearborn out to Ypsilanti. And that was subsidized by Ford Motor, the state of Michigan, and the federal government. This is the first triple overpass. This is approximately a Michigan Avenue and Ecorse Road. Also another design to help get people to the plant as efficiently as possible. Over 100,000 people came through the plant during the course of the war. 10,000 of them quit in the first week. So it's just, there's plenty. If you want to do defense work, there were plenty of plants in Detroit, a lot closer where most of the people lived. It was a contentious relationship with the union. UAW-CIO Local 50 was the bomber local. There were 33 wildcat strikes in 1943 alone. And generally, the labor unions said, we're going to play ball, we got to defeat the fascists and the Nazis. But still, the workforce was not happy sometimes, so there were odds and ends of walkouts. Societal mores about women in the workplace would fall by the wayside. Typically, you never saw women working in heavy manufacturing before the war. The men were in the service, so things changed very quickly. Rosie the Riveter emerged, women supporting the war effort in a wide range of defense manufacturing roles. Help Wanted ads said the starting wage was the same for men and women at 85 cents an hour. Problem was women often had lower classified jobs, so effectively they were paid a little bit less. Ford records, first woman hire was a nurse named Agnes Menges in February 1942. Women did essentially everything, operating equipment, cranes, welding, inspections, riveting, you name it. In the early days, the plant had the signs, "Gentlemen, watch your language." There were women present. For a while, they put up some additional signs saying, "Women, watch your language. There are gentlemen here." The most famous Rosie of them all was a woman named Norma Jean Doherty. I wish I could say she worked at Willow Run, but she didn't. She was in an electronics plant out in California. After the war, she dyed her hair platinum blonde. She and Mr. Doherty divorced. She took up acting and changed her name to Marilyn Monroe. So I'd say it would have been a great story if she was here, but not the case. African Americans at Willow Run had additional challenges from the racism of the day. There's lots of tensions between blacks and whites in the workforce which were not resolved during the war. As an example, a Ms. Anderson, could not find reference to her first name, was one of the first black women hired at the end of 1942. 5 separate trips out from Detroit on the bus, I'm sure with many stops, and then another pain going back home before they finally hired her. United Auto Workers tried to go to bat for the African Americans, not that much success. By April 1943, there were 290 black female employees out of 15,000 women, so some progress, but we did not solve society's woes. Long line of dignitaries came through. President Roosevelt in September 1942, he rode through the plant in a limousine with Henry Ford. I always stay away from politics. Obviously, it's a contentious time. It'd be fair to say Henry Ford and Franklin Roosevelt despised each other. They're political opposites. It's think of like the worst date you were ever on in your life. That's these two guys running around in a car. Harry Truman, you can see him on the center left, various 1942 and 1943 inspection trips, concerned about waste and inefficiency, government spending a pile of money, and this is back in the Willow Run days. Where are the airplanes? I don't know who the little kid is. He must be somebody, one of the politicians' sons, I'm assuming. Ford went to work on the committee's findings, such as more housing and training needed. They outsourced parts because they had such a heck of a time getting and keeping people on the workforce. Charles Lindbergh was hired, and he worked here for a while, contributing to plant inspections and test flights. He rehabilitated his reputation to a degree because he was under a lot of fire for his pre-isolationist views before the war.
Was that at the B-24 behind them?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This is Edsel Ford, Henry's son. He was pivotal in getting the plant moving forward. He was the president of Ford Motor during the war, although the old man was really calling a lot of the shots. He passed away in 1943 from cancer, and I think it'd be fair to say, had he lived, the history of the Ford Motor Company would have been significantly different, but its history is always full of what-ifs. Anyhow, by 1944, the learning curve was mastered, the change control process with the military was managed a lot better, training improved, more housing became available, and we were getting a bomber an hour off the line by spring of 1944, so a long ways from the Willow Run days, and this is a plant at full tilt. Won an Army-Navy Excellence Award for the quality of the work done in the plant, so it's a complete 180 turnaround from what had been. By the end of the war, 8,600 B-24s were built at Willow Run of various models. 1,900 of those were kit-built, and they were shipped to Oklahoma and Texas for final assembly on specially designed trucks. They were a key part of the Allied arsenal in all theaters of the war. Historian Stephen Ambrose wrote, "The B-24 didn't win the war on its own, but you can't imagine winning the war without it." And here's a painting of B-24s at work. Long story short, after the war, Ford didn't want the plant. They had their own financial problems, and it was an airplane plant. They just didn't want it. Enter Henry Kaiser on the left, Joseph Frazer on the right, both industry titans. Kaiser built Liberty ships on a mass production basis and sent troops and war materials all over the world. Frazer was a force for years in Detroit's auto industry at companies like Chrysler, Willis Overland, and Graham Page. They worked hard to convert an empty shell of a plant to car production. First day of occupancy in 1946, late 1945, one working telephone line. They ended up building 4 lines of production, 3 for Kaisers and one for Frazier's, with production beginning in June of 1946. Kaiser-Frazier built 700,000 cars plus from 1946 to 1954. This is the #1 vehicle coming off the line. I guess it was going to some car dealer out in Los Angeles. Henry Kaiser, for all his successes, did not at first grasp the scope of starting an auto company. He simply could not compete with Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. He was just undercapitalized. Operations eventually relocated to Toledo in Argentina. Kaiser-Frazier disappeared as an independent company, and just like so many of their peers did. They also built over 70 C-119 flying boxcar aircraft. You can see Frazier on the roof of the bomber plant. Some of these were repurposed as AC-119 gunships in Vietnam and had a distinguished war record. And I've looked up some of the serial numbers. One of these Kaiser-Frazer planes crashed at Tan Son Nhut in 1969 or 1970. 6 out of the 8 men were killed on a Kaiser-Frazer aircraft. Well, not that it was Kaiser's fault, but I mean, they were over there in Vietnam and they were fighting the fight. Mid-1953, the Air Force canceled the Kaiser-Frazer contract. There was a lot of concerns about cost overruns. So the plant had 1.5 million square feet extra, and as luck would have it, this is GM's transmission plant on Plymouth Road in Livonia. Burns is totally destroyed in a fire in August 1953. This plant was the sole source of hydromatic transmissions, which was GM's automatic transmission of the day, absolutely essential to General Motors. And they made 4,000 a day, and GM wasn't hurting. So they furloughed 26,000 people right off the bat, cut the hours of many more, and it cut new car production by 100,000 units, so it's a big, big deal. GM leased this Kaiser-Frazer space 8 days after the fire, so the bureaucracy was moving on overdrive, I'm sure. Bought the entire facility, and then they went to work reconfiguring it. Had 40 engineers working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Purchasing personnel traveled throughout the world to buy whatever they needed, and I think they essentially had a blank check, just go get it. We'll worry about the cost later. 1,000 machines in Livonia were destroyed. Another 2,300 were salvaged or had to be rebuilt, and some thought it would take a year back to get into production. In fact, they started producing within 12 weeks. Ed Kagi, who was a plant manager, he's on the bottom, first row, fourth from the right, thanked all the employees and their outside suppliers for their enormous contributions, for really an industrial miracle. The plant went on to produce 82 million transmissions. So you got this history of bombers, C-119 aircraft, transmissions, 82 million of them, the Kaiser-Frazer cars. The plant was enormous. Employees used bikes and scooters to get around. And it was announced in 2009 the plant was going to close when GM was filing bankruptcy and they had tons of extra real estate. Last transmission came off the line in 2010. It was signed by UAW 735 members who were on hand that day. And this was right in the middle of the Great Recession, decline in property values. So a lot of these guys and women that were laid off had some not very appealing options to deal with. So that's the plan on the left, looking a little forlorn. Just here's 3 outcomes from what happened. The former UAW president, local president, was a guy named Don Skidmore. He ended up doing work at a golf maintenance course after his GM days were over. His wife is Dawn Green. She took her severance money from GM, went back to school, got a nursing degree, and she ended up doing okay. She had a stepson who was working at the plant, and his vision, like many auto people, white and blue collar, was 30 years and out. He was laid off, and in 2018 he was still bouncing around and had no real direction. And there was all sorts of similar stories. Marriages shattered, savings gone, endless family stress and tension, so it's just not good. South of Hydromatic, but still on Willow Run grounds, another industrial story. So general map, there's Hydromatic on the left, Fisher Body, and then General Motors, Chevy's motor division on the right. This was originally used for B-24 storage. GM bought it in 1955 and built some school buses and trucks. Then they broke ground in 1958 to expand the facility for Corvair production. And the Corvair is a unique vehicle with a rear engine design, the trunk in the front. Personally, it's one of my favorite cars, so you're going to have to hear about it tonight whether you're interested in it or not. They expanded the plant to over 400,000 square feet. So it's not the bomber plant, but still, that's a lot of acreage. And here's some of the production. Cars didn't come off the line by magic. People were needed to build them. They opened it up in the middle of the '58 recession, so people waited 2 days in line to apply. Military veterans were preferred because they thought they'd be more stable, so you might be hired in the morning and be working that afternoon. They also liked hiring married men with children, thinking they'd be more stable. Cecil Cole is the man on the left. No known relationship to Ed Cole, the GM executive generally seen as the father of the Corvair. He worked in Cecil Cole, the guy on the left there, worked in a secret green room to assemble and disassemble a Corvair to understand the production requirements and how they need to build it. So the first one comes down the line. There's all sorts of GM big shots on hand. And they go to turn the keys and the engine doesn't start. driven off by this guy, Dominic Orlando on the right. This was years later. This was him in 1958. Luck would have it, he's an electrician by training. He diagnosed the problem quickly. They hooked up some wires wrong. He fixed it. Car started, so life could resume as normal. 1960, Corvairs named Car of the Year by Motor Trend. This is a later model. This is, I think, 68, 69. And behind the scenes to make these, wages were $2.19 an hour. Again, pre-OSHA, the plant's not air conditioned, so you're working your tail off. 60 Corvairs an hour coming off the line, and they just didn't stop production unless somebody pretty much died. That was about the only exception. Turnover was high. Some of the workers would go out to lunch and they just wouldn't bother coming back. So anyhow, Willow Run, our little plant here, produced 1.4 million Corvairs until production shut down in 1969. GM turned its production attention to compete with Ford's Mustang, so they built a Camaro. Ralph Nader didn't help with unsafe at any speed. One chapter on the Corvair, but it didn't do it sales any favor whatsoever. NHTSA, the National Highway Transport Safety Administration, refuted Nader's charges in 1972, but production was long gone. Nader said it was a whitewash, so you be the judge. The last Corvair, by the way, came off the line in May of '69. Nobody knows where it is. You would think it'd be a collector's item. Most people that are familiar with Corvairs think it was destroyed years ago, but it'd be quite a collector's item, but it's, I think it's pretty much gonzo. Anyhow, Corvair production wound down, many changes were coming. The first women come back on the assembly line at the plant in October '68, so the Rosie the Riveter is long gone. No women until '68. Women assemblers had to be 5 foot tall at least and weigh at least 100 pounds, and otherwise they thought they'd be physically too small for the job. They also had to wear hairnets, but this time men are starting to wear their hair longer, and the hairnet requirement didn't apply to men. So women go to management and say, what the hell is this? This is unfair. And management changed their mind and said, if you got long hair, regardless of your gender, hairnet goes on. They also built cars like that Nova I had up here. 1 year Pontiac GTO. Here's the last of the GTOs until they came up with this Australian knockoff in 2004. That was, not interested. Last of the muscle cars. Willow Run adjusted the suspensions of the first 3,000 Camaros ever built. They were shipped up from their plant in Ohio. Last model built was a Chevy Caprice. Work was then transferred to Arlington, Texas. Total output was 7 million cars. Here's this pretty nice graphic. Peak year was 1973, where 6,000 workers made 1,000 cars a day. Labor relations could be a challenging story. Any number of strikes, such as a 1970 67-day national strike by the UAW against GM, 400,000 people were out of work picketing. At one point at Willow Run, management was barricaded in their offices because the workers were choking the parking lot. So it was tense times, and what was really driving it was not only the usual stuff like salary and pension, you had overseas competition, mechanization of manual processes, and workforce needs were being trimmed down. It was just not a good scene. So the plant closes down. GM announced that in 1992. About 2,600 to 4,000 people, depending on what source you read, lost their jobs. The plant paid millions of dollars of property taxes. Employees donated time to United, the United Way, and other local causes. This couple worked there, and this is a photograph of them learning that life as they knew it was over, because the plant was being closed. This photo was up at DIA, downtown Detroit. I don't know the names of these individuals, which is too bad, because the obvious question is, well, what happened to them? There was litigation between Ypsilanti, Washtenaw County, and the GM for tax abatements that were provided to GM for jobs. Then GM walks away from the plant. GM wins, the plant closes. Anyhow, it's not just cars at Willow Run, it's also airplanes. Willow Run became Detroit's primary commercial airport in the 1940s. Previously, it had been Detroit City Airport. First airline flying into Willow Run was Capital Airlines. This is obviously North Central, but it's period correct anyhow. They used World War II's Hangar 1 as a terminal. Hangar 1 as a terminal. This shows the layout of the airlines. As you can see from the names, many of these airlines either have gone bankrupt or merged out of existence, but that's just the nature of the airline industry. In the early days, Terminal 1 was known as the barn because of its bare bones finish and its really Spartan look. So the airport hired architect Minoru Yamasaki, he's the gentleman on the right, to redesign it. So on the left is the redesigned look, much freshened up. Later in life, Yamasaki designed New York City's World Trade Center. So it kind of distinguished career on his own. The exterior, it's a neat view. The airplanes and the hydromatic plant behind it, cater corner to it. And here's the front of the terminal. Passengers walked out to the aircraft. There's no covered jetways like we're accustomed to today. There was an in-house movie theater and a hotel. Hotel advertisements said rooms were $8 to $14 a night with radio and TV included, as well as soundproofing. One of the first, if not the first, car rental outlet was Avis at Willow Run. So another first for out here. However, civilian air traffic moved out to what was known as Romulus Army Airfield. Now you'd know it better as Metro Airport. And the last commercial flight from Willow Run was a United flight to Chicago in 1966. Many distinguished people have come through Willow Run. John Kennedy came here when he was a senator in October 1960. Flew in on his private plane, the Caroline, named after his daughter. He goes to the Michigan Union at U of M, that's the photograph on the left, and he plants the seed for what became the Peace Corps. And so it was a very well-known speech, and of course Kennedy won the election and the Peace Corps came into existence. On the left, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. He received an honorary degree from U of M in 1966, so the Marcoses were here. In the sports world, the Tigers, after they beat the Cardinals in St. Louis in 1968, they were supposed to land at Metro, but they were so afraid that the fans would just overrun the airfield. They diverted it to Willow Run, so presumably Al Kaline, Willie Horton, and the rest of the team came through in '68. So I don't know if anybody was there to see them, but it would have been neat if they were. There is a long, air freight's another key part of the story. Long, colorful history of air freight at Willow Run. Many startups, mergers, buyouts, a twisted maze of companies. For years, the auto companies had numerous assembly plants and suppliers throughout North America. There were frequent flights required to and from Willow Run, often on an emergency basis to keep production running. I retired from Ford in 2019. And there was lore back in the day about Jack Nasser, who was known to be a little volatile, that production was done at one of the plants. He would call up the plant manager and use some very colorful language and probably some death threats to encourage the plant manager to get the problem fixed. So if you're that plant manager, you don't want Jack calling you up with that. So you would pay anything. If it was a missing part, you would pay just about any amount of money to get that thing shipped to your plant as soon as possible so you don't have an upset Mr. Nasser on the phone. In 1997, there were 12 freight operators at Willow Run. It was something of an aviation Wild West in the early days. It was a time when Willow Run never shut down, no matter how bad the weather is. And as you know, the weather can be pretty crappy out here. It's a little job stability. You're at the mercy of business operations and conditions. Layoffs were not unknown. Pilots sometimes slept in Willow Run buildings, carried beepers, and if your beeper went off, you were expected to be at the airport within 25 minutes ready to fly. So there was a Willow Run firehouse, and sometimes the pilots and crews would use the firemen and let them use the shower to freshen up a little bit before you take off. Air crews served as cargo loaders. So you have heavy mitts, and you'd help the forklift driver drive the pallets onto the airplane and close the door and fly the aircraft. 3 unique stories. There's many more, but just as a representative example. Zantop Flying Service was formed to provide flight lessons in 1946 out in Jackson. 4 brothers, Dwayne, Lloyd, Howard, and Elroy Zantop, formed the company. Family lore has it they borrowed $1,500 from friends and family, and they started up their service. They sold their business in '66 and then reincorporated as Zantop International Airlines at Willow Run in 1972. ZIA was once one of the world's largest cargo airlines, might carry 1 million pounds of freight a night flying out of Hangar 2, which is no longer in existence, a World War II facility. Used a hub and spoke system, similar to what FedEx uses out of Memphis, with Willow Run as the hub. Willow Run, however, had short runways, limited freight capacity. The number of auto plants began shrinking, and then there were competitors like UPS and FedEx, and the suppliers began locating either near or right in the plant, so the whole business model started imploding on them, and they finally discontinued operations in 2005. One person commented, though, that he got his start at FedEx courtesy of Zantop, and he was convinced thousands of people in the aviation industry started working for these guys out at Willow Run. So that's kind of a nice tribute. Another interesting character is Conrad Kalita, seen here under this hot rod. Born in 1938, flew a small Cessna with auto parts beginning in 1967. As well as being in the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame, he's in the National Hot Rod Association of Fame. As you can see, this is one of his passions in life. Certainly looks like he's enjoying himself. Kalita has a long, distinguished history. Just one example, two examples. After the September 11th terrorist attacks, the FAA essentially grounded everybody that's civilian, for no exceptions. However, Kalita was flying. They took 50,000 pounds of blood and platelets from Los Angeles to Philadelphia for subsequent distribution to Washington, D.C. and New York. And I think USA Jet did similar work. And then in 2020, here's a Kalita jet. These four guys flew people back from Wuhan, China that had been infected with coronavirus. So they rigged up the passenger area to minimize spread of the disease, and these guys must have taken shifts for a non-stopper from Wuhan back here to Detroit. The USA Jet is another interesting story. It's part of Active Aero that operates to this day from Willow Run. Its founder was a guy named Robert Phelps. He began as a metro airport mechanic, making about $2 an hour in 1960. Goes into business, opening Active Aero in 1979 at Willow Run. Sold his holdings in 1990s and been all sorts of reorganizations and mergers. It'd be a pretty boring discussion. They're still at it as USA Jet. 1997 story talked about Active Aero using something called the internet to help reward auction aircraft flights. So they're using technology now. And of course, we're all familiar with the international supply chain and all the problems with that. Be assured, Kalita and USA Jet are active participants in the international supply chain, key contributors to both. There are other less well-known aspects of Willow Run, such as military research. 1946, the University of Michigan acquired from the federal government for $1 Willow Run Airport with the condition that military research, that U of M would use a facility for research. So they used several different structures, one of which is the Packard hangar, which is still standing today. Unfortunately, it's not open to the public, and Hangar 2041. Packard, the building in the background, housed an Air Force Reserve unit in the 1950s. 2041 first became a computer center, which I had no clue of until in the mid-1950s. And you look at those big computers, I'm sure your cell phone's far more powerful than any of these, but that's the state of the art in the 50s. 2041 became the original Yankee Air Museum. So a little bit of neat history there. Other aspects, there was an Amelia Earhart commemoration flight took off from Willow Run in 1967. 30 years after Amelia Earhart, navigator Fred Noonan disappeared in the Pacific. Left to right, Bill Payne, Ann Pellegrino, Bill Pohemus, and Lee Kepke. All four of these people were pilots. They all took turns flying Kepke's Lockheed Electra. Yes, sir?
Lee Kepke ran Detroit Institute of Aeronautics,
Yep.
where I went to school at.
Yep, absolutely right.
And now it's Michigan Institute of Aeronautics.
So the Electra is similar to Earhart's aircraft. They took off from Willow Run, flew to Oakland, where Earhart began her trip, and they flew west to east, and they flew over Howland Island on July 2nd, 1967, 30 years to the day when Earhart was supposed to fly over Howland Island. And by mid-July, they all returned to Willow Run. As a gentleman pointed out, Kepke founded the Detroit Institute of Aeronautics in 1968 at Willow Run, taught aviation mechanics to hundreds of young people in the area, so they got their start courtesy of Lee Kepke, and you can see some of the students that work here. Sold to Maya College of Technology in 1990. He passed away in 2013, so huge contributions to aviation in Willow Run. There's a guy, he's not in the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame, but to me, he absolutely, positively should be. Oh, Myatt, they're not on campus. The current Yankee Museum's in the Myatt, one of the Myatt buildings. They're right off of I-275 and like Canton area. Yeah, just drive down 275, and they've got a big spread down in Texas. But Myatt's still in business, still doing well.
I think diversified too. They go into wind power, dispatch. They do.
No, yeah, like anything, you got to change with the times.
Exactly.
Aviation's never risk-free, and there have been any number of fatal crashes at Willow Run. A good news story was this crash in 2017, because it could have been a lot worse. This was a University of Michigan charter with a basketball team on board. There were high winds, the aircraft had a mechanical problem, so they slid through a fence right over Tyler Road, which is a service drive. If you've ever been out there, you've been on Tyler Road. And the pilots were lauded for their skills in avoiding a tragedy. Nobody was seriously injured, and you could have just easily killed all 110 people on board, so a good day out, all things considered. The Yankee Air Museum. So on the grounds, founded in 1981. This is Dennis Norton, member number 1. He's in the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame, where he certainly belongs. We have survived many challenges. The original museum, which was that hangar 2041 with the computers were gone and the hangar burned to the ground in 2004. We lost 10 aircraft, tooling, records, and it was just a complete nightmare. So it took a long time to recover from that. We survived the economic crash of '09. We were closed for about 2 or 3 months because of COVID, and we survived that, so we're still around. We purchased 144,000 square feet of the bomber plant, the original bomber plant, in 2013, and the vision was we'd fundraise enough and we'd move everything in there probably right around now. Well, unless Jeff Bezos decides to show up and likes us a lot and strokes, gives us a big check, that's not going to happen. Fundraising was just a huge challenge, so we now use it for airplane storage. We did add a 36,000 square foot hangar in 2022, and we store a fleet of 5 flyable aircraft that are going to be stored there. They're just moving in like literally as we speak. This is a shot of the fire, and it was, like I say, it went quickly. We're preserving, among other aircraft, the B-52 Stratofortress. This is a Vietnam veteran with about 600 missions over Vietnam. Its last flight was in October 1983. That's it landing over at our airport. I'm confident it was the only B-52 that has ever landed at Willow Run. 2 of our preservation crew that are working on it now service this very aircraft in their Air Force days at Utapao Base in Thailand. So they check their logbooks. You know, they were 19, 20, 21 years old. They're working ground crew. Come back home, civilian lives, they retire, they volunteer here, and wouldn't you know it, it's their airplane. So that's a neat story. We also have a B-17G on the left. It's called Yankee Lady. We purchased it for $250,000 in 1986. 9 members of the museum took out second mortgages on their homes to help guarantee the loan, because we are not, some big fancy museum like the Henry Ford where I work with lots of deep pockets. We don't have deep pockets. 9 years of work out of flying. Its crew chief was a man on the right. His name's Norm Ellickson. He passed away in 2020. And in his time, there was no doubt in my mind, Norm was one of the most knowledgeable people about B-17s anywhere in the world. In fact, we talked to him about nominating him for the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame. He's a modest guy. He just said thanks, but no thanks, which is a shame because he should be there. Also on site's the American Center for Mobility. It was founded in 2017. Funding provided by various automotive companies gave us seed money. Originally did a lot of self-driving vehicles. That seems to have fallen out of favor for now, electric battery-powered cars. So we'll see what the future brings. Much of this is on the land where the bomber plant was. Because other than the 144,000 square feet, the bomber plant's been totally torn down. So what's left? The answer to that's plenty. I mean, stuff's gone, there's no doubt about it. Air freight's still a big business. About 200 million pounds of freight move every year. Willow Run Assembly is now known as Willow Run Business Center. It's a warehouse and distribution facility. Yankee Air Museum is going strong. We host a annual air show, Thunder Over Michigan, with hundreds of volunteers. These are for the Blue Angels here just this summer, in August. ACM is going to play some role. I don't know what exactly, because as the automotive industry changes, they change. And Wayne County Airport Authority, which manages the airport, they've got a master plan, and there's plenty of new construction and enhancements coming. So we don't know exactly what the future looks like, but I think it will be bright. So how do you put all this in context? Rosie and We Can Do It is a good metaphor for the army of people that have come through Willow Run over the last 80 years. We've had good times. We've had lean times. We've had success. We've had tragedy. Entrepreneurs have come and gone. Some have struck it big, and they're huge. Others have failed, and everything in between. There's a number of constants, though, whether it's 80 years ago or today. We're dealing with societal issues. Just as society has problems, good or bad, they show up at Willow Run. Hard work, perseverance, ability to change and adapt. So to me, it's really a microcosm of America. Thank you for your time tonight. Any questions for me? Thank you. Michael.
Did the privateer make it?
Yeah,
Was it still outside?
we had a number of aircraft at an outside, it was called the Air Park. Most of those have been sold off, and we had a privateer that's still under restoration. It is in the bomber plant, so it's generally not open to the public. But it's guys have done an absolute fantastic job on preserving it.
But if you go over there on a Saturday morning or afternoon and ask for Joe Hammond, he's the head of that group that's working on there, they'll be more than happy to show you around.
Oh yeah,
Anyway,
and if you can turn a wrench, they'll
it
put you to
looks
work.
It looks better today than it did 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
To
What was
Dwight's
the
point,
firebomb, correct?
we got 11 huge, like truckload shipments of airplane parts. It was called the Scrapateer. The military name's the Privateer. It was called the Scrapateer because it was in such bad condition. So they got it standing, and they've worked and they worked and they worked. And this is George Riley. If you've ever been off I-96 in Wixom, the George Riley Public TV building, George Riley was a Navy crewman on privateers back in the early 50s. Comes home, does very well in business, and he's funding it. So he's funding the work, and I wish these guys could get more publicity because they have done a fabulous job.
Great.
Is Hangar 1 starting to be demolished yet, or
Not yet.
they're still kind of putting that off?
To Dwight's question, we used to store our flyable aircraft in Hangar 1, which was near Cater Corner to the bomber plant. Wayne County Airport Authority decommissioned it for aviation purposes. So essentially they threw all the tenants out. I guess there's asbestos in the walls. It's a World War II era building, so it's a shame because it's great history, but I'm sure sooner or later it'll be torn down. So we built the new hangar, the Roush Aeronautics Center, to house the aircraft, and the other tenants found whatever other homes they did.
Are you saying flyable aircraft?
We have 5 of them. So if you want, the flying season's just about over. So here's a sales pitch. Go to yankeeairmuseum.org. Flying season starts late April or so. We've got the B-17, we've got a B-25 Mitchell bomber, C-47, which is a military DC-3, a Huey helicopter, and knock on wood, we'll get the Ford Trimotor flying next year. So you can buy a ride, and that's one of our biggest sources of revenue are the flyable. So we'd appreciate your patronage.
Is there any truth to, I heard a story where Norway was actually developed to support Willow? So have you ever heard that?
True story? All right, we've got some Norwayne residents right here. So Norwayne was in fact developed as part of the housing. You had such a huge influx of people and there was just no housing stock.
You mentioned Yamasaki designing the interior of the Willow Run terminal.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a big Westland connection.
Yeah, it was the Quo Vadis, right?
Ovatus he designed, which is now gone, but for people like me who lived in Westland for years, we all know that. And just not too far from here, Marshall Junior High School, he designed that.
The city just bought it.
The city, well, it's still
The
there.
city just bought Marshall.
Yeah.
Where,
Oh, yes, ma'am.
where did they think Amelia Earhart went down?
The question is, what happened to Amelia Earhart's airplane? Many theories. There's some, although I don't believe it. The Japanese captured her in Noonan and executed them. There's a lot that she either crashed on the island, disappeared. I mean, the navigation and communications were so primitive, ran out of fuel, and they had this little, compared to the Pacific Ocean, a little itty-bitty airplane. So it was, in one sense, there are theories they think they'd solved that they were on an island farther south. It's better off just leaving it a mystery, at least to me, one of the great unknowns.
And when was the last commercial flight out of Willow Run?
June of '66.
66.
Yep, United flew to Chicago, and after that it was all Metro Airport.
A little bit of history. My wife, Betsy, sitting over here, her father, Jack Strauss, was an instructor at Willow Run. He was training mechanics to service the 16-cylinder.
Ford Trade School.
Yep.
Ford Trade School, we did that also. And I myself actually worked at the Willow Run for General Motors Transmission
Yeah.
Group when we were doing future design product there in 1999,
Yep.
2000, 2001.
You find people here, especially in southeast Michigan, there are so many connections to something that happened there, whether it's General Motors or Kaiser-Frazer or the bomber plant or all of them. I mean, that's absolutely right.
All of our parents worked there, everybody's parents worked there.
Yeah. Yep, I mean, it's a shame that the history's diminishing, so we like to keep the story alive about Willow Run.
Yeah.
Do you have a Facebook page or a web address or anything where we could look at your other publications?
Amazon's probably the best bet. Yep. Yeah, put my name, yeah, it'll turn up.
So don't they carry your books at Yankee Air Museum?
Yeah, they do. Yeah,
So that's the gift shop.
yeah, the gift shop, Yankees gift shop. Yep,
They have his books there as well.
yep.
There's
Yep.
all kinds of stuff there. When are they open?
10 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday, and on Sundays 11 to 4. Close on Mondays. Every so often they'll close it for a private event, so it probably always pays to check the web first.
There's lots of great books there, lots of great stuff.
Yep.
I go, there's lots of great books, lots of great things.
Yeah, no, good books. They're all good books. Any other questions?
For people who love air museums, Kalamazoo Air Zoo is a really good spot too.
Oh yeah, I mean, Selfridge, I mean, they're closing up now. Selfridge is a first-rate museum. Kalamazoo's excellent. Dayton's free and down the road, but of course you got the Air Force behind them. We don't have the Air Force behind us. Yeah. So, but there's no shortage of history. Wordsmith has an air museum. I mean, it's small, but there people there are dedicated, and they've got artifacts and records there like you wouldn't believe.
Wordsmith used to be a part of the Yankee Air Museum.
Yep. Yep. And we had several different chapters. And,
Yeah, when Yankee wanted chapters, and they kind of divested all the chapters.
yep.
Wordsmith, I think, is the only one that carried on as a standalone.
Yep.
Well, that's Connie's. Wordsmith, that's Coletta.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah, there's a big Coletta air freight maintenance where they took over when the Air Force closed the SAC base at Wordsmith. Coletta ultimately took over some big facilities there, so they got a lot of people.
He does a lot of manufacturing up there of his own parts.
Yep.
So Coletta was asked to fly on 9/11. He would have been the only.
Yep, and I think USA, I read one place USA Jet flew, but they said they interviewed the pilots, and they said it was just bizarre, because they're used to all sorts of lights from other airplanes, radio chatter, just nothing. It's like a Twilight Zone episode, and they knew the awful stuff that happened on 9/11, so it's just this living, breathing nightmare of a flight. But they did great service. So, Michigan Aviation, 19 on Amazon, $10 tonight, cash or check would be fine. And unless there's any other questions, drive safe, and hope to see you all at Yankee Air Museum someday. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our presentation. In order to discover upcoming events at the library, please visit our website, westlandlibrary.org, and click on our events calendar for a full list of everything that we have. You can also visit our Facebook page at Westland Library for daily updates. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon.